Welcome to the MSDW podcast. I'm Jason Gumpert, editor at MS Dynamics World. On this episode, we are talking with Alex Meyer. He's a principal software development engineer at Delinea, a Microsoft MVP, and a Dynamics 365 finance and supply chain management expert with a focus on security, auditing, and regulatory compliance. Delinea is the sponsor of this episode, and Alex joined me for this conversation to discuss some of the themes of his most recent MSDW webcast, which is now available on demand. Security and compliance concepts related to D365 finance and supply chain management are constantly evolving, and Alex's most recent presentation for our audience focused on the native controls in the applications. As always, there is a lot to understand when it comes to what's available now and what's going to change in the future, as well as what customers should do to prepare. We discussed some of the latest features like user security governance and how Alex advises that users build up their understanding of security fundamentals. We also discussed some of the gaps that still exist in segregation of duties within native F&amp apps and what auditors know about these issues as they do their work. And licensing is always a hot topic, but particularly now as Microsoft is attempting to roll out its new policies on technical license enforcement. Alex shares his outlook on the topic and what customers should focus on today. All right, I'm here with Alex Meyer. Alex, great to have you back. How's it going today?
Hey, Jason. It's going great. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, glad to have you. And I want to maybe just kind of jump right into this and set up our conversation with the presentation you just recently did for our audience, all about security and compliance in D365 finance and supply chain management. As I was sort of thinking about today's conversation, I thought maybe it'd be good to sort of explain how you approach this topic overall, because I think that will kind of also set up kind of some of the most recent news and most recent sort of interesting developments in the F&O product's evolution. Can you just talk a little bit more about sort of what that recent session was all about at a high level?
Yeah, for sure. So we really wanted to take a, overview approach to starting at the very bottom with setting the fundamentals for D365 F&SC security, right? How does it work? What are the main components of that? And kind of start to build up from there and talk about what features and functionality are native to the application itself, right? To help with your security, audit, and compliance journey as you go through that. And then looking at, what new things is Microsoft bringing in. It's one of the, normally this is not a space that gets a whole lot of new features or functionality. And it really seems that Microsoft's putting a focus on that recently, adding new things that can help customers with that journey.
One of the areas that you talked about was the user security governance feature. Can you say a little more about that? Is that an example of something that's pretty new still?
Yeah, so that was something that was added by Microsoft. They kind of announced it in October of 2024, and they've started to roll it out into private preview, and then it's starting to get into public preview with 10.44. And it really is, that was an IP acquisition from Microsoft, and it was adding in functionality to help users really start to dive in and be able to do some more advanced, user security and compliance functionality. Things like being able to do deep dives into cache recordings and be able to take, generate security from those, or really looking at from a license perspective, right? What is my license requirements based on my user assignments there? And then doing things like temporary role assignment or privileged user management and things like that as well. So it kind of has a lot of different features surrounding it. And all of them are, focused on trying to help, users answer those tough security questions.
Yeah. Would you say some of those new capabilities, do they reinforce some of the fundamentals that you're always talking about?
Yeah, I think they start to, obviously one of the big things that we've always preached in the past at FastPath and now part of Delinea, right, is that, security is an ongoing journey, right? It's not a one-time thing that you do and, you just forget about it, right? Especially with the new, things like the license enforcement that Microsoft is implementing right later this year. I think it kind of forces users to not just think about security, during their license renewals or maybe once a year when they're doing their access reviews, right? You really have to start thinking about it as, an ongoing thing, right? Because the license enforcement will kind of drive you to, implementing best practice for those users. So I think it really does kind of enforce the methodology that we've kind of preached in the past, for end users to implement.
Are there any other areas when it comes to fundamentals that you find that customers continue to struggle with? Maybe they're new customers or even, I don't know, even ongoing or sort of longer term F&SEM customers that still face challenges?
Yeah, that exact topic there is, one of the other webinars that I've done for MSDW with like the security gotchas. I think that those, a lot of those still apply, right? Regardless of even if you're using another ERP separate from Microsoft Dynamics, right? It's, over assignment of sysadmin type of access to the system, right? Or not doing, your periodic access reviews, right? And having users just accumulate access and it's not really least privilege access, right? So, I think that there's, still, even with the new functionality from Microsoft, there are still things that are prevalent, right, in an ERP system, regardless of, what system you're using in that case, right? It's just inherent to business applications in general.
You mentioned licensing. I do want to get to that because I think it's probably one of the most interesting and sort of urgent areas here. But before I do, you touched on this, I think, but when it comes to segregation of duties, one of the things I thought was really interesting point that you made in the recent presentation was that, gaps remain and that certain things should be flat. Like there's ways to set up security that or permissions that segregation of duties should really be flagging it. But you really have to be careful because you can't rely on the system to identify all the segregation of duties, conflicts, right? Or breaches that should be there.
Yeah, there's a couple big native gaps that still exist. And, the new functionality from Microsoft doesn't really address the methodology used for segregation of duties within the D365 application, right? The biggest ones that we still see, right, are the fact that the analysis, right, is going to be done at that duty level in the role duty privilege hierarchy, right? So you basically set up your conflicts or risks, right, to be between two duties, right? And say, hey, if the user's assigned this duty and this duty, that's going to be a conflict. And what you can kind of do, right, if you wanted to get around that, right, is if you created a role and assigned, every privilege in the system to it, the segregation duties engine is not going to capture that, right? Because you're not assigned any duties. So it's literally just looking at the assignment of those duties from that perspective. And obviously that's a big gap. The other big one that we see is that if you're using the group security idea, right, where you have an Entra ID group and you're assigning users to that group and then setting up your access within D365 at that group level security is not being applied as part of the analysis, right, from a segregation duties perspective, right? So like those two are kind of your main, gaps that we would see, right? And so what we're starting to find is that if you have internal, external auditors, right, and they're coming in and they see that, you're using the native functionality from Microsoft, that, they know that there's going to be some sort of audit finding, right, within your organization, right, because they know they're starting to become more educated on these gaps, right? So it's starting to become a more well-known thing that it's fine if you want to use that as a starting point, the native functionality from an SOD perspective. But if you really want to become truly compliant from, Sarbanes-Oxley or GDPR or, insert your audit requirement, right? You really have to start looking down at the object level, right? To really start to look at ensuring that you're compliant from that perspective.
Yeah, that was an angle that maybe I hadn't considered, which was that, if you have auditors for, whatever your industry relevant audit is, they're going to probably be coming in and knowing where to sort of start looking if they know that you're using a D365 F&SEM solution, that they're going to want to look at specific details that they know could be potential issues where maybe, I don't know, is it that they maybe haven't been as educated in the past or just that they've caught up to sort of what the standards are here?
Yeah, I think one of the things, that has always been kind of trickier with, I'll say, non-true enterprise ERPs, right? If you want to go out in the market, right, and you go and there are books written on how to audit SAP or Oracle EBS, right, and all of that. There really isn't that for Microsoft Dynamics, right, or some of these other ERP systems. And so a lot of the times, if you, depending on the audit firm that you're getting into, right, they may have a ton of SAP or Oracle EBS or, those other enterprise ERP systems, right, that experience, right, they may have that in the bag, but they really don't know some of these finer details, right, of these other systems, right? So they may try to apply their SAP or Oracle EBS knowledge, right, to Microsoft Dynamics, which may not always, be the correct use case, right? So there definitely is, as Dynamics 365, whether you're FNSC or BC, right, the market has grown for those, right? They're starting to see more, audit firms becoming more educated in the space of what do I need to look for? What are the low-hanging fruit? What are the things that, could potentially introduce risk into these systems? And so, that's the segregation duties example we just gave is one of those.
Well, to try to build a little bit of a segue here. So we have sort of the corporate, regulatory audit. Microsoft also does its own sort of audits, I guess you'd say, not as regularly. It's really not the same thing, but they will look at customers broadly about how they're licensed, right? And they'll sort of audit their licensing. And that, I don't know if I tied that well together, but licensing when it comes to FNSEM has been a bit of a weird mix, I think, of enforcement strategies and compliance strategies from how Microsoft talks to their customers, but they're trying to change that, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's one of the big or a new hot topic, right? Especially at, I just got done with Dynamics Con in Chicago a couple weeks ago, right? And obviously there's a lot of chatter online as well, but that's one of the new hot topics, right? From a customer perspective is this idea that Microsoft wants to start to actually implement license enforcement. So previously, if you want to take a look at kind of where we were and kind of where we're going, right, is that Microsoft would normally have your license renewal periods, right? And you would basically have to, as a customer, right, would have to make sure that you were compliant from a license perspective at that time of renewal, right? And there really wasn't any application level enforcement in between those times, right? So, you would go to Microsoft and say, hey, I need 100 licenses for X, Y, and Z. They would go, okay, and then during the intermediate time, right, if you grew as an organization, there really wasn't anything to stop you to say, hey, by the way, you probably should be buying more licenses to actually access the system, right? And so obviously Microsoft wants to change that. And the sticking point in the past has always been the fact that they really didn't have license reporting that was good enough or was stable enough to really be able to do the enforcement. And so now Microsoft has made the push that they would like to actually do that enforcement during login, right? So starting later this year, they'll do a soft enforcement in September 1st and a hard enforcement November 1st. And those dates have been moved a couple times. So as of today, that's where those are done or where they're set. But at that point, right, that a user during the soft enforcement, if they're not correctly licensed, will get a info log or a pop-up or dialogue when they log into D365 saying, hey, you're not licensed correctly. Please contact your system administrator. And then November 1st, during the hard enforcement, right, they'll actually stop the user at the login, right? Hey, you're not licensed correctly, right? Please contact your sysadmin. And it basically will not let the user log into the system at that point, right? So that's kind of one of the big changes, right, that Microsoft is trying to implement right now from that side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I had to chuckle a bit when I saw your session because I think they must have changed the dates, like between the time that you snapped a screenshot or took one from Microsoft perhaps, and the time that you presented, they already moved the date back, 2 months or something like that?
Yeah, they've changed that multiple times. And even, like you said, even when I've grabbed screenshots and I made a blog post and then all of a sudden they changed the date the next day. So those dates are somewhat fluid, but I do think that there's a push for Microsoft to get that implemented at some point in the 2025 timeframe.
What I've also just heard is just the certainty of it is a big challenge right now for customers, right? I mean, and I think you wrote about this in one of your most recent posts, is that whether you're working natively in F&O or in Power Platform Admin Center, Lifecycle Services, I mean, you can get different results and different reports, right? I mean, that's probably one of the hardest things.
Right now, depending on what platform you go to actually do your license reporting will probably give you a different result at the end of the day. And of course, that's not a great place to be if you're looking for certainty on, what you actually should be licensed. And so, yeah, I think one of the key things right now is that Microsoft is trying to get, their platform, right, to be your single source of truth and then push that across. And so far, they've communicated that they want the Power Platform Admin Center or PPAC reporting to be the source of truth, and that every other system behind that, right, would ingest the data from there or be able to call in and get the license information from that. But yeah, right now we're kind of in this muddy middle ground, right, where it's, LCS will give you one license report and PPAC will give you another one. And internally in D365 and get another one. You can go to M365 and get another one, right? And so it's definitely a time of uncertainty, right, from a license perspective currently for customers.
I was talking to a system integrator recently about this. I think it was even on another podcast episode. And he made the point that on this issue, they're trying to absorb as much of the sort of stress and confusion about this from customers as they can directly, because they're obviously seeing it sort of at scale with all their F&SCM customers sort of facing this. From your perspective, or maybe from sort of a FastPath Delinea perspective, are you talking more directly to customers about this? Are you hearing more from the SIs who have to sort of shoulder some of this burden or trying to shoulder some of this burden for their clients? Is it a mix?
Yeah, we definitely have customers that are trying to be proactive about their becoming license compliant, right, prior to those enforcement dates that we talked about. And, there's been a lot of chatter from the FastPath side on some of the new, stuff that we're coming out with, whether it's the telemetry data and how that gets mixed in, with your security and licensing stuff to help customers, with that license reporting. But yeah, I think, there's a combination of, you have some of your users that are more proactive, right? We've definitely had conversations with them, but there's also, like you mentioned, whether it's, partners or SIs or, what have you in that space too, where we're all kind of also in the same boat where we're trying to get, piece together different pieces of information that we're getting or different things that we see working it too. So there's definitely some chatter on that side, trying to, figure out what can we do today, right? And what's the future kind of look like from that perspective of, how do we actually, help the end user at the end of the day, right? With their license reporting and becoming compliant.
And just to reiterate, going back to the sort of security fundamentals side of things, I mean, you made the point, and I think it's kind of maybe it's really important for everyone to understand is how closely these licensing issues and sort of fundamental security concepts and tools and approaches of F&SCM are tied together, right? I mean, that's going to continue.
Yeah. And D365 is somewhat unique in that space from an ERP licensing perspective, in that the license required for a particular user is based on what that user is assigned, right? They're assigned access, not what they do, right? So you have this potential, right, where you have this delta between what is the user actually doing in the system and what are they assigned to do. And that's always kind of been an issue that, we've kind of, tried to address at FastPath. And I've, talked to end users about like, hey, how do you actually set up least privilege security? Why would you want to do this, right? And the biggest driver for, implementing least privilege security is really this idea of, if you're trying to convince your CFO or, other, CTO of, hey, why do we need to actually do this? Why do we care? The biggest thing was always, well, we can cut down on our license costs for Microsoft, right? And once you start putting it into dollars and cents, right, for them, it makes that conversation much easier. But yeah, that's one of the key points from a D365 perspective is, what you're assigned to do in the system will dictate what your license requirements are. So if you're assigned too much access, that's going to potentially require that set of users, right, to increase their license costs. And maybe they don't even need that, right, based on their day-to-day usage of the system.
Yeah. Great to understand. Yeah, this has all been really helpful. I mean, hopefully this is also sort of driving home to our listeners a few of these points. I know you're always sort of working on new blog posts, new presentations, new materials of different kinds. What are some of the other resources you've developed recently that maybe we should call out here?
Yeah, one of the features that I think is really cool is somewhat underutilized in the D365 F&SC space is the telemetry and monitoring functionality that was initially put into private preview in like 10.30, but they had all sorts of different issues with it in the first couple of releases. And they finally got it fairly stable in 10.41. And they've started to developing on top of it. But it's this idea that you can utilize your telemetry data in the application, which is basically just users performing certain actions or things occurring in the system, certain actions, and you can offload that tracking or the audit data from that to your Azure Monitor log analytics type workspace and be able to, do that large data ingestion there and then start to look at, things like, well, which forms are my users going to in the system, right? What are there any forms that are taking an extremely long time, right? Do I have long running queries? What errors are occurring, right? And you have all of these different events that you can kind of ingest and start to look at trends across your users. Maybe you've created a custom form, but no one's actually going to the form, right? They're still, finding a workaround another way, or all these different things that you can start to answer, right, with the telemetry data in your system. And so, I did a session on that again at DynamicsCon. I'll be doing a couple more this year as well. I have a number of different blog posts and things about that, but I think the possibilities on that side, right, of what you can actually do with that data, especially with the custom telemetry events, right? So there's the standard ones from Microsoft, but then you can create your own custom ones as well. And you can do really cool things, like view auditing. Hey, when's the last time somebody viewed this sales order, right? Or, like we use at FastPath, right? We actually tie that usage data against your security and licensing, right? And be able to show you, here's what this user's assigned, here's what they actually use in the system, right? Do you want to look at removing that access, right? So I think that is, if you are in the D365 space and you look at like some of the stuff that is happening on the Business Central side with telemetry, you'll start to see how big of a gap there is between how BC has implemented telemetry and how FNSC has implemented it so far, right? And so I think, I would like to see the ecosystem kind of move towards all of the really cool things that BC has either integrated or that you can get out of the system with telemetry data on that side, right, on the FNSC side as well.
Oh, yeah, really interesting. Something to watch for the future. Well, Alex, maybe we'll end it there. For the listeners, we'll post links to the recent webcast on demand that you can look at, Alex's most recent blog post, and maybe some of those other resources. And Alex, thanks. It's always great talking to you. Always learn a lot. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, thank you, Jason, for having me today.
This has been another episode of the MSDW podcast. My thanks once again to Alex Meyer for joining. And this message from Delinea. For all the latest expertise on D365 F and SCM security and compliance, as well as information on the FastPath suite of solutions from Delinea, check out their page on MSDW. We'll post a link in the show notes. And that's it for this episode. If you want to get in touch with me, you can send me an email, jason@msdynamicsworld.com. For all of our updates, please do follow us on LinkedIn. Until next time, this is MS Dynamics World, signing off.